The dust kicked up around Jake's worn boots as he led the stubborn mare through the narrow streets of Silver Creek. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, patches visible on both knees of his jeans. The morning sun beat down mercilessly and sweat had already begun to stain his faded shirt. He'd been up since dawn, trying to earn a few dollars by breaking in horses for the local ranchers, but work was scarce, and his stomach had been empty since yesterday. Jake moved slowly, his eyes fixed on the ground. At 23, life had already worn deep lines into his face. His father had died in a mining accident when Jake was 15, leaving him to care for his ailing mother. When she passed 2 years later, he was left with nothing but debts and a tarnished family name. Now he wandered from town to town, taking whatever work he could find with horses, the only skill his father had taught him before the accident. As he turned the corner near the general store, loud voices caught his attention. A group of 4 men had surrounded someone against the brick wall of the building. Their laughter was cruel, the kind that made Jake's skin crawl. He hesitated, knowing that getting involved in other people's business was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had no friends in this town, no reputation to fall back on, and certainly no money for a doctor if things turned violent. But then he heard her voice. It was quiet, steady, but laced with fear. A young woman was trying to push past the men, but they kept blocking her path. One of them grabbed her arm roughly, and another made a crude comment that made the others laugh louder. Jake could see her now through the gaps between the men. She had long black hair and bronze skin, and she wore a simple cotton dress that marked her as Apache. The silver bracelet on her wrist caught the sunlight as she tried to pull free. Jake's hands tightened on the mare's reins. He knew what people said about the Apache in these parts. The wars might have been over for years, but the hatred lingered like smoke after a fire. Mixed bloods and full bloods alike faced suspicion and contempt in most towns. This young woman was clearly alone, and these men knew she had no one to defend her. The largest of the men, a thick-necked brute with a gray beard, shoved her hard against the wall. Her head hit the brick with a sound that made Jake wince. The man's hand moved to her dress, and something inside Jake snapped. His mother had raised him better than to stand by and watch such things, poor as they were. Jake tied the mare quickly to a post and walked toward the group. His heart hammered in his chest and his mouth went dry. He had no weapon, no plan, and no idea what he would even say. But his feet kept moving forward until he was close enough to smell the whiskey on their breath. The young woman's eyes met his for just a moment. They were dark brown, wide with fear, but there was also something else there. Pride, maybe, or determination not to cry in front of these animals. That look reminded him of his mother in her final days, refusing to show weakness even when the pain was unbearable. Jake cleared his throat, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in his own ears. The men turned to look at him, their faces showing confusion first, then annoyance. The bearded man still had his hand on the woman's shoulder, pinning her against the wall. The street around them was strangely empty. Jake realized that other people had seen what was happening and had simply walked away, choosing not to get involved. He understood that choice. He'd made it himself many times before, but today something was different. Maybe it was because he'd hit rock bottom and had nothing left to lose. Maybe it was because he was tired of feeling like a coward. Or maybe it was simply because he couldn't bear to see that fear in another person's eyes and do nothing about it. The bearded man spoke first, his voice a low growl. He asked Jake what he wanted, using words that made it clear he wasn't welcome. Jake's mind raced, trying to find something to say that wouldn't end with him beaten bloody in the street. He looked at the young woman again and she gave the smallest shake of her head, as if warning him to stay away to save himself. But Jake had already made his choice. He opened his mouth and spoke, his voice surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. He told them to let her go. Simple words, but they hung in the air like a challenge. The men stared at him for a long moment, then burst into laughter. They couldn't believe this skinny drifter was trying to play hero. The bearded man released the woman and took a step toward Jake. He was at least 6 inches taller and probably 60 pounds heavier. His fists were the size of small hams, scarred from countless fights. He asked Jake if he knew who he was dealing with, if he understood that the woman was just a savage who didn't belong in their town anyway. Jake's jaw tightened. He could feel his knees wanting to buckle, but he forced himself to stand straight. He said he didn't care who they were, and he repeated his demand. Let her go. The words came out harder this time, with more conviction than he actually felt. Behind the big man, he could see the young woman's expression change from fear to something like disbelief. She clearly hadn't expected anyone to stand up for her, especially not some broke wrangler who looked like he could barely stand up for himself. The first punch came faster than Jake expected. The bearded man's fist connected with his jaw, and suddenly Jake was on the ground, tasting blood and dirt. His vision blurred for a moment, and he heard the men laughing again. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard one of them say they should teach him a proper lesson about minding his own business. Jake tried to get up, but a boot caught him in the ribs, knocking the wind from his lungs. He curled up, trying to protect his head and stomach. Another kick landed on his back, and pain exploded through his body. He'd been in fights before, but never against 4 grown men who wanted to hurt him badly. This was different. This was serious. Then, through the haze of pain, he heard her voice. The young woman was shouting at them in English mixed with Apache words he couldn't understand. She was telling them to stop, that he'd done nothing wrong. One of the men told her to shut up, but she kept yelling. Jake forced his eyes open and saw her trying to pull the bearded man away from him. The distraction was enough. The beating paused for just a moment, and Jake managed to scramble to his feet. His left eye was already swelling shut, and he could feel blood running from his nose. Every breath sent sharp pains through his chest where they'd kicked him. But he was standing, and that felt like a small victory. The young woman had positioned herself between Jake and the men. Her hands were raised, and she was speaking rapidly, trying to calm the situation. She said they should all just walk away, that no one needed to get hurt any worse. But the bearded man was red-faced with anger now, furious that some Apache girl and a worthless drifter had challenged him in front of his friends. He raised his hand to strike her, and Jake moved without thinking. Despite the pain, despite knowing he couldn't win, he lunged forward and grabbed the man's arm. It was like trying to hold back a bull. The man turned with a roar and threw Jake against the wall with terrifying ease. Jake's head bounced off the brick and stars exploded in his vision. But his action had an unexpected effect. From down the street, someone shouted. Jake couldn't make out the words, but he heard boots running on the wooden boardwalk. The men heard it too. The bearded man cursed and took a step back. He pointed at Jake and said this wasn't over, that he'd better leave town before sunset or he'd regret it. Then he and his friends hurried away, disappearing around the corner just as the sheriff came into view. Sheriff Morrison was an older man with gray hair and a stern face. He looked at Jake, bloodied and slumped against the wall, then at the young woman who was breathing hard but appeared unhurt. He asked what had happened here, and his tone suggested he already had a pretty good idea but wanted to hear it anyway. The young woman spoke before Jake could gather his thoughts. She said there had been some men causing trouble, but they'd left. She said Jake had helped her, that he'd stopped them from hurting her. The sheriff looked skeptical. He asked Jake if that was true, and Jake just nodded, not trusting himself to speak yet. His mouth was full of blood and his head was spinning. The sheriff sighed deeply. He said he knew the men who'd been here, recognized their work. He said Jake was either very brave or very stupid, probably both. Then he told them both to clear out. He said the young woman should go back to wherever she'd come from, and Jake should find somewhere to clean himself up. It was clear he didn't want to deal with the paperwork or the trouble that would come from pressing charges against the local troublemakers. As the sheriff walked away, Jake tried to stand up straight but nearly fell. The young woman caught his arm, steadying him with surprising strength. Up close he could see she was probably around 20 years old, with high cheekbones and eyes that showed intelligence and wariness in equal measure. She asked if he could walk, and he managed to nod. She told him her name was Ayana. It meant eternal blossom in her language, though she said it with a hint of bitterness as if the beautiful name seemed out of place in her hard life. Jake gave her his name in return, though speaking made his split lip throb. She looked at him with something between gratitude and concern, then said she knew a place where they could get him cleaned up. Jake wanted to refuse. He'd already drawn enough attention to himself, and being seen with an Apache woman would only make his situation worse, but he could barely see out of his left eye, and his legs felt like they might give out at any moment. He didn't have many options, so when Ayana started walking, supporting some of his weight with her shoulder under his arm, he went with her. They moved slowly through the back streets of Silver Creek, avoiding the main roads where people might see them. Ayana seemed to know every alley and shortcut, moving with the confidence of someone who'd learned to stay invisible in a hostile town. Jake stumbled along beside her, each step sending fresh waves of pain through his battered body. She led him to a small shack on the edge of town, near where the buildings gave way to scrubland and desert. It was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, with gaps in the boards that let in streams of dustlight. But it was shelter, and more importantly, it was private. Ayanna helped him inside and eased him down onto a rough wooden bench. The interior was sparse but clean. There was a small cooking area, a bedroll in the corner, and a few possessions that suggested someone lived here alone. Ayanna moved to a bucket of water and began tearing strips from an old cloth. She brought it to Jake and started cleaning the blood from his face with gentle hands. As she worked, Jake studied her in the dim light. Her movements were efficient, practiced, as if she'd tended to injuries before. He wondered about her story, how she'd ended up in this town, why she was living alone in this shack. But asking questions seemed rude when she was helping him, so he stayed quiet and tried not to wince every time she touched a tender spot. Ayanna finally broke the silence as she wrung out the bloodied cloth. She asked Jake why he'd helped her, why he'd risked his life for a stranger. Her voice was soft but direct, and her eyes searched his face for the answer. Jake didn't know what to say. He thought about his mother, about the values she'd tried to instill in him despite their poverty. He thought about all the times he'd walked away from trouble, choosing survival over doing what was right. He told her he didn't really know. Maybe he was just tired of being afraid all the time. Maybe he was tired of seeing people get hurt while everyone else looked away. His voice was rough, and not just from the beating. There was something raw and honest in his words that surprised even him. He admitted he hadn't planned to help, that every instinct had told him to keep walking. But he couldn't. Not this time. Ayanna nodded slowly, as if she understood something he hadn't said out loud. She told him that most people in this town wouldn't have done what he did. Most people saw her as less than human, just another Apache to be pushed around or worse. Her father had been a scout for the army, she explained, and when he died, her mother had married a white trader. But her mother passed from fever 2 winters ago, and the trader made it clear Ayanna wasn't welcome anymore. She'd been surviving on odd jobs ever since. Washing clothes, mending things, sometimes cleaning the saloon early in the morning before customers arrived. She lived in this shack because the rent was almost nothing, and the landlord didn't care who stayed there as long as he got his money. It wasn't much of a life, but it was survival. Today had been different, though. Those men had been getting bolder, and she'd known it was only a matter of time before things got worse. Jake listened, recognizing the familiar weight of hardship in her story. They weren't so different, he realized. Both of them were alone, both struggling to survive in a world that didn't care whether they lived or died. The main difference was that people hated her for her blood, while they simply ignored him for his poverty. Neither was a good position to be in. Ayanna finished cleaning his wounds and sat back to examine her work. His face was a mess of bruises and cuts, but at least the bleeding had stopped. She said he should rest here for a while, let the swelling go down before he showed his face in town again. Jake knew she was right, but he also knew that staying here put her at risk. If those men found out she was sheltering him, they'd come after both of them. He tried to stand, saying he should go, but his legs buckled immediately. Ayanna caught him again, her strength surprising for someone so slight. She guided him back down with a firm shake of her head. She told him he wasn't going anywhere in his condition, and besides, those men would be watching the streets. If they saw him trying to leave town, they'd finish what they started. Jake wanted to argue, but exhaustion was catching up with him. The adrenaline that had kept him going was fading, replaced by waves of pain and fatigue. His eyes kept trying to close, and his thoughts were becoming fuzzy. Ayanna seemed to notice. She brought him a cup of water, and he drank it gratefully, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. She told him to sleep for a while. She promised to keep watch and wake him if anyone came near. Jake tried to protest, but she cut him off with a look that reminded him of his mother. It was a look that said arguing would be pointless, that she'd made up her mind. So he let himself lean back against the wall, and within moments, he was drifting into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of fists and angry faces. When Jake woke, the light coming through the gaps in the walls had changed. It was late afternoon now, and the heat had become oppressive inside the small shack. He sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his body. Every muscle ached, and his face felt like it had been trampled by horses. But he was alive, and that was something. Ayanna was sitting near the door, keeping watch as she'd promised. She had a small knife in her hand and was carving something from a piece of wood, her movements precise and careful. When she heard him move, she looked up and asked how he felt. Jake managed a weak smile that probably looked more like a grimace and said he'd been better. She offered him some dried meat from her meager supplies. Jake tried to refuse, knowing she probably couldn't afford to share, but she insisted. They ate in comfortable silence, and Jake found himself grateful for the simple act of not being alone. For years, he'd kept to himself, never staying in one place long enough to make friends or connections. It was safer that way, or so he'd told himself. As the shadows lengthened, Ayanna shared more of her story. She spoke of growing up between two worlds, never quite fitting into either. The Apache called her too white because of her mixed blood. The whites called her a savage because of her Apache features. She'd learned early that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, that showing weakness meant inviting cruelty. But she also spoke of her mother, who'd been kind and strong. Her mother had taught her about healing herbs and how to survive on very little. She'd taught her to read and write, skills that many Apache women never learned. Most importantly, she'd taught her to never give up, to keep fighting even when the world seemed determined to crush her spirit. Jake listened and found himself sharing too. He talked about his father, about learning to work with horses before he could barely walk. He talked about his mother's illness and death, about the loneliness that had followed. He admitted that he'd been drifting for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have a purpose, to matter to someone. As darkness fell, Ayanna lit a small oil lamp. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an intimate atmosphere that made conversation easier. She asked Jake what he planned to do next. Those men had told him to leave town before sunset, and that deadline had passed. If he stayed, they'd come looking for him. If he left, he'd be abandoning the only work opportunity he'd had in weeks. Jake admitted he didn't know. Part of him wanted to run, to put Silver Creek behind him and never look back. But another part, a part that had awakened when he'd stood up to those men, wanted to stay. Not because of pride or stubbornness, but because running away felt like letting them win. It felt like admitting that people like him and Ayanna didn't deserve to exist in places like this. Ayanna watched Jake carefully as he wrestled with his decision. After a long moment, she told him something unexpected. She said she had a plan, but it would require trust and courage, two things that were in short supply for both of them. Jake leaned forward, ignoring the protest from his sore ribs, and asked her to explain. She revealed that she'd been saving money for months, hiding every penny she could spare. Her dream was to leave Silver Creek and head north to Colorado, where she'd heard there were mining towns that cared more about workers than about the color of their skin. She'd been too afraid to make the journey alone, knowing that a single Apache woman traveling through this territory was asking for trouble. But with a companion, especially a man who could handle horses, the journey might be possible. Jake was stunned by the proposal. She was offering to pool their resources to travel together toward a better future. It was risky, maybe even foolish. They barely knew each other, and traveling together would make them a target. People would assume the worst about their relationship, would see them as either criminals or something shameful. But what was the alternative? Staying in Silver Creek meant constant danger for both of them now. He asked her how much she'd saved. When she told him, his eyes widened. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to buy supplies for the journey and maybe rent a room in a boarding house once they reached Colorado. Combined with what little he had, they might actually make it. The question was whether he had the courage to try. Ayanna seemed to sense his hesitation. She told him she understood if he wanted to refuse. She knew that being seen with her would make his life harder, that it might close doors that would otherwise be open to a white man, even a poor one. But she also said that sometimes you had to take risks to change your circumstances. Playing it safe had kept them both alive, but it hadn't given them anything worth living for. Her words struck deep. Jake realized she was right. He'd been playing it safe for years, and where had it gotten him? He was broke, alone, beaten up, and facing threats from men who saw him as worthless. At least if he left with Ayanna, he'd be moving toward something instead of just running away. He'd be choosing a direction instead of letting life push him wherever it wanted. He told her yes. They would leave together. Ayanna's face showed surprise first, then something that might have been relief or joy. She smiled, and it transformed her face, making her look younger and less burdened. Jake found himself smiling back, despite the pain it caused his split lip. They spent the rest of the night planning. Ayanna knew the terrain better than Jake did, having traveled these lands as a child with her father. She sketched a rough map in the dirt floor, showing him the safest route north. They would need to avoid the main roads where they might encounter trouble. Instead, they'd follow old trails that the Apache had used for generations, paths that wound through canyons and mesas where few white men ventured. Jake contributed what he knew about horses and supplies. They'd need 2 horses at minimum, plus enough food and water to last several weeks. The journey would be hard, especially going through desert terrain in late summer. But it was doable if they were smart and careful. He suggested they leave before dawn while the town was still asleep. It would give them a head start before anyone noticed they were gone. Ayana agreed, but she added one condition. They needed to be smart about their departure. If they left together openly, it would draw attention and possibly pursuit. Instead, she suggested they leave separately and meet at an old abandoned mine shaft about 5 miles north of town. She knew the place well and could find it even in darkness. This way, if anyone asked, they could each claim they'd left alone. As they refined their plan, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was real. For the first time since his mother's death, he felt like he might have a future worth working toward. And more than that, he felt like he had an ally, someone who understood what it meant to struggle and survive against the odds. Ayana seemed to feel it too. She moved around the shack with new energy, gathering her few possessions and preparing for the journey. She packed her mother's silver bracelet, the one Jake had noticed earlier, wrapping it carefully in cloth. It was clearly precious to her, one of the few things she owned that connected her to family and heritage. As midnight approached, they finalized the details. Jake would leave first, taking his mare and heading out through the east side of town where the buildings were sparse and the night watch was weakest. He'd stop at the edge of town to gather some basic supplies from the brush, whatever he could find or catch. Ayana would wait 2 hours, then leave on foot through the west side. She knew a man who sometimes left an old mule tied near the edge of his property, and she thought she could borrow it without waking him. The plan was risky, but it was the best they could devise. Jake felt nervous energy coursing through him as he prepared to leave. His body still ached from the beating, but adrenaline was pushing back the pain. He checked his pockets, making sure he had everything he owned, which wasn't much. A few coins, a knife his father had given him, and a small photograph of his mother that had somehow survived all his travels. Before he left, Ayana stopped him. She placed her hand on his arm, her grip firm and warm. She thanked him again for what he'd done, for standing up for her when no one else would. She said it meant more than he could know, that it had reminded her that not everyone in the world was cruel or indifferent. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. He told her she didn't need to thank him, that he should be thanking her for giving him a reason to believe in something again. They stood there for a moment, 2 people who'd been beaten down by life but who'd somehow found the strength to try one more time. Then Jake stepped out into the night, moving carefully through the shadows toward where he'd left his mare. The town was quiet, most people long since asleep. Only a few lights still burned in windows, and the saloon at the far end of the street leaked music and laughter into the darkness. Jake reached his horse without incident. The mare nickered softly when she recognized him, and he stroked her nose to keep her quiet. He untied her and began leading her away from town, his heart pounding with every step. Each sound seemed amplified in the night, every snap of a twig or rustle of wind making him freeze and scan the darkness for threats. Jake had made it about a mile from town when he heard voices behind him. He froze, his blood turning cold. Had someone seen him leave? Were they following him already? He pulled the mare off the main path and crouched behind a large boulder, his hand over her nose to keep her from making noise. The voices grew closer, and Jake's heart hammered so hard he thought it might give away his position. 2 men passed by on the path, talking in low tones. Jake recognized one voice immediately. It was the bearded man from earlier, the one who'd beaten him. They were discussing something about watching the roads tomorrow, about making sure that Drifter didn't try to sneak back into town for his things. They laughed about how they'd teach him a real lesson if he showed his face again. Jake held his breath until the voices faded into the distance. That had been too close. If they'd looked in his direction, if the mare had made any sound, it would have been over. He waited several more minutes to be sure they were gone, then carefully led the horse back onto the path. His hands were shaking now, the reality of how dangerous this escape really was hitting him fully. He pushed on through the darkness, using the stars to guide him north. The desert night was cold, a sharp contrast to the brutal heat of the day. Jake was grateful for it, though. The cold kept him alert, kept him moving when exhaustion threatened to drag him down. His injured body protested every step, but he forced himself to keep going. Ayanna was counting on him to make it to the meeting point. After what felt like hours, Jake spotted the old mine shaft that Ayanna had described. It was little more than a dark opening in a rocky hillside, partially hidden by scrub brush. He led the mare into the shallow cave entrance and settled down to wait. The night was at its darkest now, that deep black that comes just before dawn. Jake tried to stay awake, tried to watch for Ayanna's approach, but his exhausted body had other ideas. He woke with a start to find pale light creeping across the sky. Panic seized him immediately. Had he slept too long? Had Ayanna been unable to escape? Had something happened to her? He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the sharp pains that shot through his battered body. The mare was still there, peacefully grazing on the sparse grass near the cave entrance, but of Ayanna there was no sign. Jake paced back and forth, his mind racing through terrible possibilities. Maybe those men had caught her trying to leave. Maybe she'd changed her mind and decided it was too risky. Maybe she'd never intended to come at all, and this had been some kind of test or trick. But even as these thoughts tormented him, he knew they weren't true. He'd seen the hope in her eyes when they'd made their plans. She'd wanted this escape as much as he did. Just as the sun broke over the horizon, Jake spotted movement in the distance. A figure was approaching on foot, leading what looked like a very reluctant mule. As they got closer, Jake recognized Ayanna's walk, the way she carried herself with quiet determination. Relief flooded through him so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. She'd made it. But as Ayanna drew closer, Jake could see that something was wrong. She was limping and her dress was torn at the shoulder. When she finally reached the cave, he could see a fresh bruise on her cheek and scratches on her arms. The mule she'd borrowed looked skittish, its eyes rolling white with fear. Something had happened during her escape. Ayanna collapsed against the cave wall, breathing hard. For a moment she couldn't speak, just held up a hand asking for time to catch her breath. Jake brought her water from his canteen and she drank deeply. Finally, she told him what had happened. She'd successfully taken the mule without waking its owner. But on her way out of town, she'd run into two of the men from the bearded man's group. They'd been drunk, stumbling home from the saloon. They'd recognized her immediately and tried to grab her. She'd fought them off, surprising them with her fierceness. The Apache way had always been to be strong, to fight when necessary, and her father had taught her how to defend herself. She'd kicked one in the knee hard enough to drop him, and when the other tried to grab her, she'd scratched his face badly. The commotion had woken some dogs, and their barking had drawn attention. In the confusion, she'd managed to run, but they'd seen which direction she went. They'd know she was heading north, away from town, and they'd tell the bearded man, who would undoubtedly come looking for revenge. Their head start, which had seemed comfortable before, was now dangerously thin. They needed to move fast if they wanted to stay ahead of pursuit. Jake helped Ayanna onto the mule, insisting she ride despite her protests. She was clearly exhausted and hurt, and they'd move faster if she conserved her strength. He mounted his mare and they set off immediately, pushing the animals as hard as they dared. The sun was rising quickly now, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. It would have been beautiful if they weren't running for their lives. They rode hard for several hours, following the old trails that Ayanna knew. The path wound through narrow canyons where the rock walls rose high on either side, creating a maze that would be difficult for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain to follow. It was dangerous riding. One wrong step could send horse and rider tumbling into ravines, but it was their best chance to lose any pursuers. Around midday, they stopped to rest the animals and themselves. Jake's body was screaming for relief. Every jolt of the horse's gait had sent fresh waves of pain through his injured ribs and bruised muscles. Ayanna wasn't much better off. She moved stiffly, wincing when she dismounted from the mule. They found shade under an overhanging rock and collapsed there, too tired to speak. After a brief rest, Ayanna checked their supplies. The situation wasn't good. In her rush to escape, she'd only been able to grab some of her saved money and a little food. Jake had even less. Combined, they had enough to last maybe 3 or 4 days if they were careful. The nearest town where they might buy more supplies was at least a week's journey away, and that was assuming they didn't get lost or delayed. Jake suggested they try hunting along the way. His father had taught him to trap small game, and Ayanna knew which desert plants were edible. It wouldn't be comfortable, but they could survive if they were smart. The bigger concern was water. Their canteens were already half empty, and water sources in this desert country were few and far between. Ayanna pulled out the rough map she'd drawn from memory and studied it carefully. She pointed to a spot maybe 2 days' journey ahead. There was an old Apache settlement there, long abandoned, but it had a reliable spring. If they could make it there, they could refill their water and rest properly before pushing on to Colorado. It was risky because the settlement was known to local ranchers, but it was their best option. They decided to push on through the afternoon, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Silver Creek. As they rode, Jake found himself thinking about what they were doing, really doing. They weren't just running away from trouble. They were choosing a different life, one where they controlled their own destinies instead of being pushed around by circumstances and cruel people. On the second day of their journey, disaster struck. They'd been following a narrow trail along a steep hillside when the mule suddenly balked. Ayanna tried to calm the animal, but something had spooked it badly. Before anyone could react, the mule reared up and threw Ayanna from its back. She landed hard on the rocky ground and lay still. Jake was off his horse in an instant, his heart in his throat. He knelt beside Ayanna, afraid to move her but desperate to know if she was all right. After what felt like an eternity, she groaned and opened her eyes. Pain was written clearly across her face, but she was conscious and alive. Jake carefully helped her sit up, checking for broken bones. Her left wrist was swelling rapidly and she couldn't put weight on her right ankle. The mule had bolted down the trail and disappeared around a bend. With it went half their supplies and their backup transportation. Jake cursed under his breath, then immediately apologized to Ayanna. She managed a weak smile and said she'd heard worse from her father's army friends. But the smile faded quickly as the reality of their situation set in. She was injured, possibly with a broken wrist and sprained ankle. They had one horse between them and limited supplies, and they were still at least a day and a half from the spring. Jake made a quick decision. They couldn't stay on this exposed trail, and they couldn't afford to wait for Ayanna to heal. He'd have to get her to the abandoned settlement where they could properly assess her injuries and rest safely. He helped her onto his mare, then climbed up behind her, holding her steady as they continued down the trail. It was slow going with both of them on one horse, but there was no other choice. As they rode, Ayanna leaned back against Jake's chest, her strength clearly fading. She apologized for slowing them down, for being a burden. Jake told her firmly that she wasn't a burden, that they were in this together. He reminded her that she'd saved him back in Silver Creek by tending his wounds, by giving him shelter when he had nowhere else to go. Now it was his turn to help her. They were partners, and partners looked out for each other. His words seemed to comfort her, and she relaxed slightly in his arms. As the day wore on, Jake found himself talking to keep her awake and alert. He told her stories about the horses he'd trained, about his father's dreams of owning a ranch someday. He talked about his mother's garden, how she'd grown vegetables even in the poorest soil, creating beauty and sustenance from almost nothing. Ayanna listened, occasionally sharing her own memories of better times. They rode through the afternoon and into the evening, pushing the mare as much as they dared. Jake was worried about the horse. She was carrying double weight in harsh terrain, and he could feel her beginning to tire. But they had to keep going. Stopping in the open desert at night with Ayanna injured would be inviting trouble from both nature and any men who might be following them. As darkness fell, Jake began to worry they'd miss the settlement. The landmarks Ayanna had described were hard to spot in the failing light. But then, just as the last rays of sun disappeared below the horizon, he saw it. A cluster of adobe structures nestled in a small canyon, barely visible against the rock walls. The abandoned Apache settlement looked like it had been deserted for years, but the buildings were still intact. Jake guided the mare carefully down into the canyon. As they approached the settlement, he could hear the blessed sound of running water. The spring was still flowing just as Ayanna had promised. Relief washed over him so powerfully that he felt tears prick his eyes. They'd made it. They were safe, at least for now. He helped Ayanna down from the horse and into the largest of the adobe buildings. The roof was partially collapsed, but one corner was still intact enough to provide shelter. Jake made Ayanna as comfortable as possible, then went to care for the mare. The horse desperately needed water and rest. He led her to the spring and let her drink her fill, then found a patch of grass where he could tether her for the night. When he returned to Ayana, he found her examining her injuries by the light of a small fire she'd managed to start. Her wrist was badly swollen and turning purple. She said it might be broken, though she could still move her fingers slightly. The ankle was less serious, probably just a bad sprain, but it would make walking difficult for several days. She looked up at Jake with worry in her eyes. She asked how they would continue the journey with her in this condition. Jake sat down beside her and took a moment to think. The truth was, he didn't know. Their situation had gone from difficult to nearly impossible. They had limited food, one exhausted horse, and Ayana could barely walk. The men from Silver Creek might still be pursuing them, and they were still weeks away from Colorado and the new life they'd hoped to find there. But giving up wasn't an option. They'd come too far, risked too much to turn back now. He told Ayana they would rest here for a few days, let her injuries start to heal, and give the mare time to recover her strength. In the meantime, he'd scout the area for food and see if there was anything useful left in the abandoned settlement. Once Ayana could travel again, even if slowly, they'd continue north. It might take longer than planned, but they'd get there eventually. They had to believe that. Ayana reached out with her good hand and squeezed Jake's arm. She said she trusted him, that she believed they could make it. Coming from her, someone who'd learned not to trust easily, those words meant everything. Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He'd gotten them this far, and he'd get them the rest of the way, whatever it took. Over the next 3 days, they settled into a routine. Jake spent his mornings hunting and foraging, using the skills his father had taught him. He caught rabbits and found edible plants that Ayana identified. She couldn't walk much, but she could still prepare food and tend to other tasks while sitting. They worked well together, each compensating for the other's limitations. In the afternoons, Jake would help Ayana practice walking, supporting her weight as she tried to put pressure on her injured ankle. It was slow progress, but each day she could go a little further. Her wrist was definitely broken, so Jake made a splint from straight branches and strips torn from his shirt. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until they reached a town with a real doctor. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. They shared more of their histories, their hopes and fears. Jake learned that Ayana had always wanted to learn to read better, to maybe even teach someday. She believed education was power, the one thing no one could take away from you. Jake found himself admiring her resilience, her refusal to let circumstances crush her dreams. Ayana learned that Jake had once wanted to breed horses, to create a line known for intelligence and temperament, rather than just speed or strength. He'd given up on that dream after his parents died, but talking about it now, he felt the ember of that ambition rekindling. Maybe in Colorado, if they worked hard and caught a few breaks. It wasn't completely impossible. On the 4th morning, Jake woke to find Ayana already up, testing her ankle by walking short distances around their shelter. She was limping badly, but she was mobile. She declared herself ready to travel, though Jake could see the pain she was trying to hide. He wanted to give her more time, but he also knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Their food was running low again, and there was always the risk of discovery. They packed up their few belongings and prepared to leave. As Jake helped Ayana onto the mare, she paused and looked back at the abandoned settlement. She said her people believed that places held memories, that the spirits of those who'd lived there remained to watch over travelers. She whispered a brief prayer in Apache, thanking the place for giving them shelter, asking for continued protection on their journey. Jake didn't understand the words, but he understood the sentiment. This place had saved them when they needed it most. As they rode out of the canyon heading north once more, he felt a mixture of hope and determination. They'd survived this far against considerable odds. They'd faced violence, injury, and hardship, but they were still moving forward, still fighting for something better. The journey ahead would be long and difficult. They both knew there would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But they also knew they weren't facing those challenges alone anymore. They had each other, and that made all the difference. Two people who'd been broken down by life had found strength in partnership, had discovered that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust someone else and let them trust you in return. As they disappeared into the vast landscape, the rising sun painted the sky in brilliant colors behind them. It felt like a promise, like the dawn of something new. Whatever waited for them in Colorado, whatever struggles still lay ahead, they would face it together. And that gave them a fighting chance at the life they both deserved.